Hello, Tennessee Voices viewers and listeners. This is David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. Today, I have two guests with me, and I'm very pleased to introduce Brian Belser, who's a reentry specialist for Men of Valor based in Knoxville, and Curt Campbell, Program Director at Men of Valor, who's based in Nashville. And Men of Valor, we're going to have a robust conversation about prison reentry, recidivism, and the role of faith ministries. So, gentlemen, welcome. How are you doing today?
Thank you, David. Great to be here. Doing good.
Doing well. Thank you for having us, David.
Absolutely, Brian. Well, tell us a little bit about Men of Valor, of what it is and how you got involved in it.
You may start, Brian.
Go ahead, Curt.
So I actually started volunteering with them in '97, which is the year they were founded. And they were founded by a guy named Carl Carlson, who was doing prison time here in Nashville, Tennessee at the Old Walls. Some people call it the Castle, where they shoot movies now. And he came to Christ there, and it really changed his life from that moment on, literally, until he passed in 2014. And Carl is pretty representative of a lot of the men we work with, and that they grew up in very, very high dysfunction. He was left on a doorstep as a child and orphaned, grew up in foster homes and orphanages, and started doing time when he was 10 years old. Just madness, discovered drugs and alcohol. One thing led to another. And anyway, but Carl's a great example of guys who nobody is beyond the reach of God to redeem and restore life. And so that's really what we're about, is trying to connect with men in prison, their families, to offer hope, that many of them experience incredible hopelessness, like the world is against them and has forgotten about them. And thankfully, that's not true across the board. And so we've got an opportunity to love on them, help them, try to reestablish a life coming out of incarceration.
Thank you for that. And Brian, how about you? Tell me a little bit about your story.
So mine's a little different. When Curt was volunteering, I was in prison. But so I did right at a little over 20 years in the Department of Corrections myself. I was locked up from the time I was 19 till almost 40. And I knew I got saved in prison also when I was on max. And I knew God had called me to ministry, and I couldn't think of anything I was qualified to do except prison ministry. So I'm sort of a due diligence guy, and I got to investigating all the different prison ministries around. I was living in Nashville at the time. Men of Valor kept coming up. I went down to a class, which is actually the name of our podcast, Put a Word on It. And I had never been more sure I was exactly where I was supposed to be in my life. So we laugh about it now. I told our discipleship director after that class, I said, hey, I'm going to work here. You just don't know it yet. So until you can hire me, just treat me like I do. And so I did. We call it my internship now. Yeah. I did almost a year working 20, 30 hours a week down in the ministry. And when the opportunity came available for them to hire another staff, I was asked to interview and was fortunate enough to have been chosen for the job.
I'd love to learn more a little bit about how you make Men of Valor work. From the perspective of you, Curt, how do you engage with men who are in prison? And Brian, I'd love to learn more a little bit about how you initially received the invitation, or if you volunteered, how that went. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, David. And it's not terribly hard, believe it or not. I alluded to earlier, most men in prison feel very forgotten, rejected, and alone. And so when somebody, a free worlder, as they call them, or volunteer, comes in of their own volition on their own time to just be there and acknowledge that they're there, that somebody cares about them, they're not forgotten. There's obviously an element of trust that has to be developed and some consistency, but generally speaking, these guys are very open to relationship. And so that's really where we start. We are evangelistic inside the prisons. We want guys to come into a relationship with Christ, but typically that happens through relationship. So we just go in to spend time with guys and listen to them, hear their stories, empathize where we can, share truth. I've said for years what God has called me, and I really believe others, all of us, to do is to love these guys and tell them the truth. That's really all we can do. Love them and tell them the truth. They're going to make their own choices, hopefully better than what led them to prison. But that's really the crux of our ministry inside the walls, is just our presence and loving these men.
Oh, thank you so much, Curt. And Brian, tell me about how you found Men of Valor, how they found you, and what was that process of being rehabilitated by Men of Valor?
So I had gotten out of prison, and as I said, I came to a relationship with the Lord while I was inside of prison. And I just knew the easiest way I can describe it, David, is when I came to understand everything that God had done for me, it seemed like a very small thing for me to give him back what I've got left of this life. And I have a unique, I'm going to call it giftedness, in that the guys can relate to me. So when I go into the prisons, there's not only people who know me, I mean, some of them are still locked up that I was locked up with, but we have a saying, you can't teach me if you can't reach me sometimes. So the guys know that I've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt, so to speak. So they're open to hearing what I've got to say a lot more maybe than somebody who doesn't have a background like myself. And the way I would phrase it, Paul says it best, the things that happened to me in my past have turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. So my bad decisions, one of my sayings that I tell our guys all the time, what we see as trials, God's using as training. And I never in a million years dreamed that I would be going back into prison teaching and discipling men just like me. But in hindsight, God has uniquely equipped me to be able to do that in a way that I never saw coming, just to be quite frank, but that it makes the men reachable. And to sort of springboard off what Curt said, we do what we refer to as relational discipleship. Paul says, not only did I share the gospel with you, but shared my life with you as well. So we get to know the men on a personal level on the inside. So we do small, what we call D groups every week at each of the prisons. And it's just a small group Bible study. And we get to know what one of the first things we do is talk about highs and lows for the week. You know, we want to know what's going on in their life. What are you struggling with? What's good that's going on? We pray with them. We counsel them, love them, and tell them the truth. You know, that's a bad decision you're making, or this is not the right way to get that done. And prayerfully, we've built a good enough relationship with them by the time they are released that when they come into aftercare, we already have that relationship established, and they know that they can trust what I tell them and will hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that a lot of people make just not having godly men in their foxhole.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate you sharing that vulnerability in your own story of being in prison and your own rehabilitation. We're coming close to the midpoint of the conversation. I always like to ask guests what they've been doing to stay well and healthy during this time of COVID. I mentioned off the air that we essentially, as leaders, often don't take care of ourselves as well as we should because we're taking care of other people. So tell me a little bit about how you have taken care of yourself. What are you reading, watching, doing just to stay healthy and well? Why don't we start with Brian and then go to Curt?
Good.
All right. So I have done several things. One of the things that the ministry is great in providing is our self-care. You know, that is a very big focus for us. Nonprofits and ministries have two of the highest burnout rates of anybody. So our leadership and staff is very focused on making sure that we take time I'm actually reading 3 books right now, David. Beyond Addiction is a great one I'm reading. I just finished Lead Like Jesus. So I try to read and just stay very engaged with my family. And we did a lot of stuff outside that we hadn't done in a while. So it's really been, I've seen God work probably as much or more through COVID. You know, our approach that we took is not what can't we do, but what can we do? And Raul was very specific about that at the beginning, that I don't want to hear what we're unable to do. What can we do? So I think we've pivoted and adjusted well to continue to bring the ministry to the men to the best. We had to do some by Zoom classes, but we were able to continue to serve the men both in aftercare and on a limited basis inside the prisons as well.
That's good.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Brian. Curt?
Yeah, for me, David, so I've got a creative gene. I love to write. I love to play music, love to listen to music, love to read. And I'm like Brian, I love the outdoors. I'm an empty nester now, so my wife and I have had a great chance to just spend time together, whether that's walking at the park or things like that. But just making it a point every single day to do something that fuels me. One of my mentors years ago said, if your output exceeds your intake, your upkeep will become your downfall. Isn't that good? And so just stay fueled so that you've got something to give, that we should minister out of the overflow of our hearts, not the bottom of the cistern.
It was really interesting. I had one of the guests I recently had was Tony Parker, who was the former commissioner of correction. And he talked a lot about the value that he placed on nonprofits like Men of Valor to reach inmates, because obviously one of the challenges we have in this country is we have an incredibly high incarceration rate, especially compared to the rest of the world. And I don't know if the nonprofit gets into root causes or how to prevent recidivism, which I think is one of the things that you do. But what are some of the conversations around it that you have?
Yeah, so there's a lot to that. One of the ones we're focusing on right now, and of course, a new hot topic is trauma. We're seeing more and more of the effects of early childhood trauma, the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Most of our guys score very, very high in that, and we know what that leads to. And one of those things is incarceration. Of course, one is addiction and lack of education, on and on and on. So one thing is trying to help our men identify the trauma in their lives, talk about it, because they're not alone. A lot of us have experienced trauma in some form or fashion. And sometimes there's just healing in the acknowledgement of it. So our staff is being trained more and more on how to deal with trauma. And then other things, of course, that affect recidivism are just lack of resources for people coming out. It's not, re-entry is not rocket science. It's not easy, but it's also not, we can do it and we can be successful at it. And so just taking the necessary steps to help a guy get identification, transportation, employment, some counsel regarding how to take care of fines and get license reinstated, all that kind of stuff, where he doesn't fail with the Board of Probation and Parole. All of those are factors. And so I feel like Men of Valor excels in a lot of that, just helping men transition successfully.
Brian, can you talk a little bit about your own connection? Because you having been formerly incarcerated, you have a connection that's very deep with what other men are going through. How do you approach those conversations when you talk about, how to avoid going back, and to back to prison?
Well, David, one of our counselors has a saying, and it encapsulates it very well. He says, if you want to change the fruit, you have to address the root. And with myself and probably 95% of the men, and I've sat in on hundreds of guys' stories, And every one of them, you could almost interchange the person and the circumstance, but there was something happened, usually before 10 years old, that was a trauma. They weren't emotionally equipped to deal with it. They didn't have people to come alongside them and help them deal with it. So typically they masked it with drugs, and whether it was alcohol, drugs, or whatever. Then the alcohol or the drugs takes on a life of its own, snowballs, and then that's what leads to the crime. So, I mean, you can really trace the whole act back to the why. And a lot of times, as Curt said, when a man is just able to put his finger on, okay, this is when I started thinking and acting that way, and these are the results of that. So when they can identify that and get some tools in their toolbox for processing through it, and we believe from a biblical point of view, we believe God's word addresses any situation that you're going to come across in your life. So when you're putting a biblical perspective to what happened, you realize it wasn't your fault. Then you can start to facilitate the change in the thinking that keeps men from ending up back in prison on that revolving door. Because honestly, a lot of them aren't criminals, they're drug addicts. And when they identify the reason that has been spurring that on and on for all these years, it doesn't have the power that it used to. So really just helping the men, and it was pivotal for myself as well, just identifying this is why I behaved the way I did, other than a sin problem. But these are the catalysts that were driving me. And when you identify those and learn some ways to spot the triggers and the things that cause you to get into that way of thinking, then it's easier to deal with that on a practical level and not be reactive so much as processing through the situation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's very, very powerful. This whole things of learning those skills, and really they're survival skills, aren't they?
In many ways.
And I think Brian, you touched on something that I've talked to past guests about who are involved in rehabilitation work, and that includes the issue of many people who are live with addiction or a mental illness, who are vastly overrepresented within the prison system, and finding those wraparound services to help them overcome that is another challenge. Would either of you talk to that, please?
I can. You know, we're going in the right direction for sure. Excuse me. When I was in prison, there were not many rehabilitative type classes. It was lock them up, throw away the key. When their sentence is over, we'll let them out. When they mess up, we'll lock them back up again. Well, in the last several years, there's been a shift. And quite frankly, I think it's come as a result of just about everybody knows somebody now who is either a drug addict or has been to jail or has been to prison. So it's not somebody else's problem anymore. It's everybody's problem. So by people knowing that and coming to get involved in a ministry where they can make a difference, whether that's as a job partner, giving people a second chance on a job, whether that's coming and being a mentor for some of our guys, just to help talk to them and walk them through some of the situations that it's not a if it's going to happen, it's a when it's going to come up. And, you know, teaching classes and just plugging into the ministries and the resources that are already tapped in, but we can't do it by ourselves. You know, it takes a village. And in Nashville, we've been blessed that, you know, I think last year, Curt could tell you a better number, but I think we had over 300 volunteers involved last year in our ministry. And we're very prayerful that we're going to get the same type of response over here in Knoxville now as we're expanding. But it's just people not turning a blind eye to it anymore and saying, hey, maybe they're not such a leper because my son's in the same situation now, or my nephew. And I think it's just gotten so widespread that it's no longer somebody else's problem.
Mhm.
Curt, do you have anything to add to that as well?
No, I think Brian said it well. We've all got something to offer, and sometimes it's just welcoming somebody. Like, part of what we're trying to help people realize is these aren't people you necessarily have to be afraid of. And it means a lot to somebody coming out of incarceration to be asked, tell me your story and how'd you get here? And, what can I do for you? That's just, it's huge. There's already so much shame attached with having a felony record and feeling rejection. And so all of us have the ability and the power in words to speak life into somebody and encourage them.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for being on the show. Curt Campbell, Brian Belser of Men of Valor. Before I let you go, however, I always like to ask my guests if they would leave our audience with some words of wisdom to help us get through this challenging time.
Curt, you're the wise one.
Man, for me, just from a faith perspective, David, and we say this with our men, our work is eternal. And for believers, all things are going to work together for good for those who love God and called according to his purpose. So whether it's pandemic, whether it's cancer, whether it's stock market going nuts, whatever it is, we can trust God's heart toward us and live in peace, anxiety-free, knowing that the one who is sovereign over all things is in control. Even when it appears he's not, he is, and he loves us and he's for us. So it's a great peace and comfort in that.
Thank you. Curt, any final words, Brian?
I would second that with trust in the Lord with all your heart and all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. It starts and ends. If this relationship is good, these relationships are going to fall into place where they're supposed to. So submit to God, see what he can do. He's done amazing miracles in my life. I still sit in shock and awe sometimes, just going, wow. So, but it's all God.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. May you stay well and healthy. And I'm so grateful for you appearing on today's episode of the Tennessee Voices video podcast.
Thank you, David. Blessings to you, man.
Thank you for having us, David. Enjoyed it.